Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon for everybody. I am Gisela Fávaro. I am a postdoctoral student at the Department of Modern Language at University of São Paulo. It's a pleasure to stay this afternoon with you. This event is a part of Abralin ao Vivo, Linguistics Online series, which is an initiative of Abralin, Associação Brasileira de Linguística, Brazilian Linguistic Association, with the cooperation of many other international associations such as Comitê Internacional Permanente de Linguística, Associação de Linguística e Filologia de América Latina, Sociedade Argentina de Estudos Linguísticos, Sociedade Espanhola de Linguística, a Linguistic Society of America, Linguistics Association of Great Britain, Societas Linguística Europeia, Australian Linguistic Society, Associação Internacional de Linguística Appliquée, and the British Association for Applied Linguistics. Today, we are here to talk about universal inefficiency, different ways of violating the one form, one meaning principle and their effects on communication and learnability. We are going to listening Professor Dr. Sterre Leufkens. It's a pleasure to stay with you today. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. Who is an assistant professor in Dutch linguistics at Department of Languages, Literature and Culture and Department of Dutch Language and Culture at Utrecht University, the Netherlands. Professor Sterre studies the learnability and the complexity of languages of the world, as well the implications of those students for language education. She is a leader in a project that developed a web app that aims to make knowledge of structured parts of language accessible to the teachers of Dutch as a second language. This helps them to anticipate on differences and similarities between Dutch and those languages in their education practices. In this presentation, Professor Sterre will show that we can other languages on a continuum from more transparent to less transparent, and moreover that various non-transparent phenomena stand in an implicational relation to each other, even though different domains of a linguistic organization, phonology, morphology, and syntax are involved. Thank you so much, Professor Sterre, for accepting to be part of this event. It's a pleasure to listen to you this afternoon here in Brazil. I think in the Netherlands, it's the beginning of the evening. Let's to listening our presentation, your talk, to Team Universal Inefficiency, different ways of violation the one form, one meaning principle and their effects on communication and learnability. Thank you so much. It's with you now.
Thank you, Gisela, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak here today. And hello, everyone. I don't have a clue who I'm talking to or how many of you I'm talking to, but I hope that many of you are there and that you will enjoy this talk. First, I'm going to share my slides with you. There we are. Here we have a wonderful view of the Domtoren in Utrecht, where I haven't been for a few months because of the coronavirus restrictions. But at least we have this nice picture of it. Yes, universal inefficiency is what I'll be talking about today. And to start off, I would like to show you some examples of inefficiency, because we have many systems in the world that are really efficient, but there are also systems that seem not so efficient. This one, for instance, if you want to turn on the television, you can push a button, but you can also develop a system like this to push the button. But, well, it probably works, this system, but as you see, you have to take many steps to get there. So probably not so very efficient. Another example is this box. It's called the useless box, and you can see why it is called a useless box, because you switch the button and then it does nothing. Actually, it does something, but it doesn't do anything useful. So also an inefficient system in a way. Another example are our wisdom teeth. These wisdom teeth, we have them, they are there. They used to have a function, but through centuries, millennia of evolution, they have lost that function, but they're still there. And sometimes they can even be quite painful while they don't serve any function anymore. So another inefficient system. Here we have a pepper and salt grinder. That by itself is an efficient thing, a very useful machine, but this one has only one exit for both the salt and the pepper. So that's not so efficient, that's not so convenient. And a final example of something inefficient is this story. Cleaning lady comes today, better clean up before she gets here. Of course, that's also not a very efficient thing to do because you're doing the same work twice. Why am I showing you all these inefficient systems? Well, because in a way, language is an inefficient system too. I myself used to always think that language was this very elegant system that through evolution becomes completely adapted to what we use language for. And that is very efficient. But in fact, when you take a closer look, there are things in all languages of the world that are not so very efficient. And that is what I'm going to show you today. That's what I'm going to demonstrate and discuss. So I will show you how human languages are inefficient systems in a way. I will show you how and why they become inefficient systems and how they remain inefficient systems. How some languages are more inefficient than others. I will show how this inefficiency can be linked to cognition and to socio-historic properties of the speaker communities using those languages. And I will also show you how inefficiency can sometimes be an advantage. That may seem to be a bit of a paradox, but I'll show you that it's true. This is the structure of my talk. I first go into the notion of transparency, which is sort of the technical term for this efficiency I've been talking about. And I'll show you how transparency can be violated. So examples of inefficient properties of languages. Then in the second part of the talk, I go into the typology of transparency. I'll show you that we can rank languages on their degree of transparency. And we can also rank non-transparent features. And then in the second half of the talk, I will go into the notion of redundancy, which is a specific type of non-transparency. And I'll tell you a bit more about that. And I'll also discuss the typology of redundancy more specifically. The talk, well, Gisela has given me about 1.5 hours to talk about this, which is of course quite long. So I'm planning to take 2 small breaks of like 5 minutes so that we can all get a drink and take a bathroom break if needed. Okay, let's dive in. Transparency and non-transparency. So transparency, the idea is born from the idea that a maximally efficient language system would express every single meaning in a single form. So one meaning always expressed in one form. That seems to be intuitively ideal, a perfect outcome. Maybe you could also say, well, for a speaker, for a sender of a message, it would be even more efficient if it would be as least forms as possible. So less form would be more efficient. But then that would be not very practical for the receiver, who would only hear one form and who would have to decipher all the meanings contained by that form. So if you take into account both the needs of senders and of receivers, and of course all language users are both senders and receivers, then you could say, well, it would be ideal, it would be maximally efficient to have each meaning expressed in a single form. This has been referred to as the one form, one meaning principle. I call this the transparency principle or transparency. And this is not a new idea. It actually has been discussed and studied before, for instance, by these sources listed here. Also, some of you who are familiar with optimality theory might be reminded of the notion of faithfulness, where you have this one-to-one relation between input and output. So that's sort of similar. It's not exactly the same as transparency, but it's similar. This one meaning, one form principle, this idea of transparency, also seems most efficient from the perspective of language learners. And somebody who has done research into that topic is Dan Slobin, who studied first language acquisition in the 70s and 80s. Well, still doing that actually. But for instance, in this 1970 paper, he wrote a lot about transparent structures, and he said, well, transparent structures are easy to understand for first language acquirers, for second language acquirers too. They are easy to understand. They are also the first to be acquired in L1 acquisition. First, children learn the transparent structures of a language, and only then they learn the irregularities, the other things. And Slobin also says that transparent structures are favored in any situation in which intelligibility is under pressure. For instance, in a noisy room, then as a speaker, you will be tempted probably to use more transparent structures. Not consciously necessarily, but probably you will be using transparent structures because those are easier to understand. And the same is true in L2 acquisition. And for instance, in the situations in which creoles emerged, where of course, intelligibility was under severe pressure, and where people started using more transparent structures. Something similar is said by Wouter Kusters in his dissertation from 2003. He says, a language is easier to learn for an L2 learner the more it obeys this transparency principle. So both Slobin and Kusters already noted that one meaning, one form seems to be the easiest for language learners. So also in that respect, it would be efficient, it would be ideal if all languages were fully transparent. Transparency is a theoretical notion. This one meaning, one form relation is a bit of an abstract idea for you maybe. So to study it, it was necessary to operationalize it, to make it more concrete. And to do this, I have used the framework of functional discourse grammar, a framework developed at the University of Amsterdam by Kees Hengeveld and Lachlan Mackenzie. I will not go into this model today, that would take too much time, but the relevant thing about it for today is that functional discourse grammar, FDG, separates or distinguishes between 4 levels of linguistic organization. So pragmatics, semantics, morphosyntax, and phonology. And this is actually what you need to be able to define or operationalize transparency. And I think other frameworks would be able to do that as well. So it's not the case that transparency can only be studied from this perspective. It could probably be applied to other frameworks as well. But for today, I'm taking this model as my basis. So in FDG, in functional discourse grammar, a one-to-one relation between meaning and form, we have made this more concrete by translating this to a one-to-one relation between units at these 4 levels. So a transparent structure would be a structure that has a unit here that corresponds to a unit at the semantic level, which corresponds to a unit at the morphosyntactic level, which corresponds to a phonological unit. To give you an example, let's say I am referring to myself. Then in FDG terminology, I would be doing an act of reference. I would be referring to myself, which is a pragmatic act, so to say. Now, this act of reference would correspond to a semantic unit, the concept of me. Starts sounding a bit philosophical here. Then this semantic unit corresponds in turn to a morphosyntactic unit, the noun, the name Sterre. And this corresponds to a phonological unit. So this is a transparent situation. We have a one-to-one-to-one-to-one relation, a one-to-one relation between meaning and form. However, this is not always the case. There are many ways in which this transparent structure can be violated. For instance, by a property like a feature, a linguistic feature like grammatical gender. Let me illustrate this example. So I am having this presentation today, this talk. So when I'm referring to that talk, I am again doing an act of reference. And that corresponds to a semantic unit, the concept of the presentation. This in turn corresponds to a noun, a morphosyntactic unit. I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to speak Portuguese, but the important thing here is that this noun is feminine. So it has a gender. This gender, feminine gender, is not motivated by any unit at one of the upper two levels. There's no meaning that corresponds to this formal property of the noun, this feminine gender, and which in turn results in the form of the article of the determiner here. So here we have a violation of transparency. We have a non-transparent feature, grammatical gender. And grammatical gender is a feature in the category of what I call form-based form. So this is a form, there's a formal feature, this gender of this noun, that is not based on meaning, but is purely form-based. So that is one category of violations of transparency, the form-based forms, where we have a 0-to-1 relation between meaning and form. And these form-based forms are inefficient because there is a form, so maybe an item, a word, an affix, something, or maybe a rule or a feature that has no pragmatic or semantic counterpart, no higher up motivation. And grammatical gender is an example, but also declensional classes, expletives, heavy NP shift, phonological assimilations, which have a phonological motivation, but no semantic or pragmatic motivation. So in a way, these are all like this useless box, right? You do something, you have a form, you have this switch, and well, something happens, but it's not motivated by any higher function. So that's one type of violations of transparency. Another type is fusion, another category of violations. So for instance, take fusional morphology. Like in Brazilian Portuguese, we have this affix, this suffix, which codes all these different meanings. So there are multiple semantic units, and they're all expressed in this single form. So here we have a many-to-one relation between meaning and form. By the way, I've given these arrows here to show you that there is some pragmatic unit here that corresponds to the semantic unit. So these relations are transparent. I just didn't want to give all the technical terms for the pragmatic units that are here. But this interface is transparent, but it's here where the violation happens. Here we have a case of fusion, where there's a many-to-one relation between meaning and form. Fusion is inefficient, non-transparent as well, since different meanings are expressed in a single form, which makes them indistinguishable from each other. Just like with the salt and pepper grinder, if you have only one exit for both the salt and the pepper, then you cannot distinguish them anymore. So if you only want pepper, then you get the salt as well, and that's problematic. And examples of these fusion violations are fusional morphology, also suppletion. So when you say went, the English past tense form went, I went somewhere, you have both the past tense as the lexical stem. They are sort of fused together, they're indistinguishable from each other. So that's the case of fusion as well. And irregular stem formation is another example of violations in this category. A third category is redundancy. That's another way of violating transparency, where you have a one-to-many relation. So with fusion, you have a many-to-one relation between meaning and form. Here we have a one-to-many relation. There is one meaning which is expressed multiple times. For instance, in the case of negative concord, there is one pragmatic negation, one semantic negation, but at the morphosyntactic level, we see two units that both carry a negation meaning. So ain't nobody, for instance. The semantics of this combination is only one negation. So here we have a 1-to-2 relation, which is non-transparent. That's an example of redundancy. And redundancy, again, is inefficient in a way because a single meaning is expressed by multiple forms. As a speaker, you're doing too much work, basically, like someone who cleans their house before the cleaning lady comes, who's again cleaning the house. And examples are, well, different types of agreement can be cases of redundancy, negative concord, consecutio temporum, where the tense in a subordinate clause is copied from the tense of the main clause. And there are many other examples. I'll go into those later. For now, it's only relevant to know that redundancy is this third category of violations of transparency. Some things that are important to say at this point. I've been saying that these non-transparent features are inefficient. That's of course true. But at the same time, they may have advantages. So for instance, fusion, of course, we can see why people would want to fuse different morphosyntactic units together, right? Then you'll be quicker. For economy reasons, you might want to fuse some things and express different meanings in one unit. On the other hand, you might want to use extra words and be redundant because you want to be more expressive in some way. And there are many other advantages that you can see these non-transparent features having. So when I say inefficient, I don't mean that there is no reason why you would use these things at all. No, possibly, or in many cases, there are reasons why you would still want to do it that way. But still there are violations of this one-to-one meaning to form principle. So from a point of view of efficiency, like I said, for the optimal outcome of the needs of senders and receivers and acquisition, they are still inefficient in a way. Another thing to note here is that transparency is not the same as simplicity. Often they are well, they're used together or they are compared with each other, these notions. So I think it's important to be clear about the difference that I see between these things. And to do that, I give these examples of Turkish and Dutch. In Turkish, we see this really long word, which is composed of all these separate bits. And in Dutch, we see only short words, but a slightly longer sentence, the girl that walked through the garden. And what we see here, in Turkish, we have a lot of, in the Turkish example, there are a lot of morphemes. So I think most people would agree if I would say, well, this is a pretty complex word, or at least this has a complex morphology. But still, at the same time, it's really transparent because each morpheme very neatly has one meaning. Not completely, because here we see some fusion and here we see this unit that doesn't have a meaning, so a form-based form. So it's not completely transparent, but it's quite transparent. But at the same time, it's very complex. Then we have this Dutch example, which seems pretty simple. Like all these words, well, they look simple. They're not long or many morphemes or so. But still we see some examples of non-transparency. So there is grammatical gender. You have to know that the gender of this noun is different than the gender of that noun. There's also a case of fusion here. So here, what I want to demonstrate here is that Turkish can be said to be complex but transparent, while Dutch looks simple but non-transparent. So they're two different things. And the difference is that complexity is about the number of forms to me. Well, there are many, of course, many different people who have worked on complexity and everyone has a different definition, but I think roughly you could say that complexity is usually has something to do with the number of forms that you see. while transparency is purely about the relation of forms to their meaning. So I would say, if I would go back to these examples of inefficient systems, that this is a very complex system. There are all these steps that this person takes to turn on the television. So it's a complex system, but a very transparent system. I mean, it's very clear, every step, what it's doing in the process. Well, here we have a pretty simple system. This box, it does one thing, so it's pretty simple, but it is non-transparent. So this would be the Turkish language, the Turkish example, and this would be the Dutch example. Another relevant notion here that I want to introduce is learnability. So learnability is about how easy or how hard is it to acquire something. And if we're talking about learnability of language, we're usually talking about the speed and the success of language acquisition. Well, there's obviously a lot of literature on learnability. How can we establish how learnable a language is? Is it the case that all languages are equally learnable, or can we say that some languages are harder than others? There's, of course, a large debate about that. Let me say that I would say that learnability of a language is presumably at least partly determined by its complexity, so about the number of forms somehow, and at the same time by its transparency. I think at least those two notions should be taken into account if we want to say how hard it is to learn a specific language. But of course, the question then is, what is this relation between transparency and learnability? Does transparency make a language more learnable or less learnable? So let's take a look at what the literature says about that. And actually, there's evidence that different types of non-transparency may have different effects on learnability. So form-based form, all these features in that category, all these forms that are there but have no meaning, they often are really difficult to learn. So for instance, Dutch grammatical gender is acquired by L1 learners only when they are 8 years old. So they get the system before that, but they, of course, from all the nouns, they have to know which gender they have. And that takes them a long time. So they make mistakes in that until they're sort of 8 years old on average. And L2 learners struggle with this even more. So L2 learners are only really successful. They only acquire grammatical gender fully if they get enough Dutch input before 4 years of age. So that tells us that this is really a difficult feature, because especially in L1 learner and in L1 learning, usually things are acquired earlier, right? And the same seems to be true for fusion. It's also a thing that is hard to learn. So the study by Dimitriadis et al. Was actually an experimental study in which people learned artificial languages. And if that artificial language had fusional morphology, then L2 learners of the artificial language, they had a harder time. It took them more time and they made more errors than when the artificial language had concatenative morphology. And also an example from real life, a natural example, is that the irregular plural in Egyptian Arabic is acquired at 6 years of age, which is, of course, for L1 learning quite late. So apparently this is a difficult thing. Then for the category of redundancy, it's a bit harder to say whether that makes a language more or less learnable. To my knowledge, there's no clear evidence from acquisition research on the learnability of redundancy. Please do let me know if I've just missed the literature on this. If there's anything you know about this, I would love to hear about that. What is often said, for instance, by Jenny Oudering on gender systems is that redundant marking increases the learnability of, in this case, gender systems. So you can imagine, right, if you think about these Dutch kids who have to learn the gender, the grammatical gender of each noun, they can only ever acquire this when they get enough evidence. So the more redundant marking of gender there is, for instance, the more gender agreement there is, the easier it will get to do that, to acquire that gender system. So redundancy may facilitate learnability in a way. It may facilitate the learning of the feature that is expressed redundantly. At the same time, it might increase the acquisition, the learnability of the acquisition of that particular feature, but we don't know whether the redundancy, so for instance, the agreement itself is also easy or hard to learn. That we don't know. So tentatively, I would say redundancy facilitates the acquisition of specific features that are expressed redundantly. So in that sense, it increases learnability. On the other hand, it may be quite difficult to acquire itself. But we don't know that, or I don't know yet. Then, now I have introduced all this terminology. Let's go to the second part of this talk, and let's have a look at the typology of transparency. So 2 questions are relevant here. First of all, are all languages equally transparent? You might think that all languages have some of these non-transparent features, but maybe some of them have more than others. Second question, is the presence of non-transparent feature in languages random? Is it the case that, well, this language has a case of form-based form and that language has a lot of fusion, but it's just random? Or is there a pattern in there? Let's have a look. This line of research started with Kees Hengeveld, working at the University of Amsterdam. And under his lead, a number of case studies were performed in Quechua, Korea, Sri Lanka, Malay, and Esperanto. And these case studies already indicated that languages have different degrees of transparency. So some languages have more non-transparent features than others. And this was at the basis of my PhD dissertation, in which I studied 22 languages, and I scored them for the presence of 22 non-transparent features. This is a coincidence, by the way, that it's both 22. And then after my PhD dissertation, more studies have been done. So there's more and more languages being added to the database of these transparency studies. What I did in my PhD dissertation was I drew a diversity sample, so a sample with languages that are maximally typologically and genealogically diverse, so that I would find a maximum range of degrees of transparency. I hope to find a super transparent language and a super non-transparent language if there were indeed those differences. And I did that by scoring of the presence of those 22 features, just check if they were there or not there. And I looked for those features by studying reference grammars of the languages included in a sample. Sometimes I used other linguistic literature if the reference grammars didn't suffice. And in some cases, I've asked experts on those languages or native speakers. Then onto the results. This is a table from Hengeveld and Leufkens 2018. So not from the PhD dissertation, but from a paper later with more, where we've added more data. There's a lot of information here that you won't need to follow this talk, but let me just quickly show you how it works. So here you see the languages. Here you see the non-transparent features. So a plus means that a language has this particular feature. So these are non-transparent features. So the more pluses, the more non-transparent a language is. And the more minuses, the more transparent a language is. So this is a ranking from a non-transparent language to a very transparent language. And you see that there is a pattern. Not only the languages are ranked, but also the features are ranked. There are some counterexamples here, but overall a pattern emerges from this table. So on the basis of this table, on the basis of these results, we can answer this first question. Are all languages equally transparent? No. all languages in this sample have a plus somewhere. They have some non-transparent features, but some have more pluses than others. So some are more transparent than others. This table also shows us that transparency is a relevant typological variable. It shows that these diverse features, this mixed bag of non-transparent features, which play at different interfaces. Some are phonological, some are syntactic, some are semantic, and that involve different types of violating transparency. They can all be sort of linked together in this pattern that we find. So that's the first intermediate or second intermediate conclusion that we can draw here. Okay, I've been talking for a while already, so I thought this would be a good moment to take a first break, and I suggest that we just that it's a break from like 3 minutes or so, and I'll just keep sharing my slides and just mute myself, so that we can all have a drink or go to the bathroom, and then I'll continue the talk in about 3 minutes. Okay. Okay, a few minutes later, I hope you're a bit refreshed. I'd like to continue the talk. Yeah, so I've shown you this table with a ranking of languages and a ranking of features. And now first, I would like to go into this ranking of languages. Here at the top, you see that the languages are ranked from least transparent, most non-transparent, to most transparent. And perhaps this is a bit small to read and you have to tilt your head like this, so I thought it would be easier to just put it on that slide like this. And there are also some other languages from other studies included here. So we go from most non-transparent to most transparent here at the bottom. Now, of course, you might wonder, seeing this, how can we understand, how can we explain that some languages are more transparent than others? Why would that be the case? Why would Taiwa be transparent compared to, for instance, Egyptian Arabic? In fact, oh, my arrow isn't working. Yeah, now it works. So what drives this variation in degree of transparency? And I think an explanation is found in studies of language contact, Creole studies, social linguistics, and second language acquisition. There is a perfect explanation available in those domains for these different degrees of transparency. Because what we have seen already is that some types of non-transparency are hard to acquire, especially for L2 learners, but also for L1 learners. So form-based form and fusion especially are really difficult to learn. We may expect that a language used by a community with a high proportion of L2 learners that struggle with these kind of features might tend to lose such features. So for instance, this is something we see when we look at grammatical gender in Germanic languages. English has no grammatical gender. It used to have it, but it has lost these grammatical genders over time, possibly as a result of a lot of L2 learning of English. Well, we see that, for instance, Icelandic and German, which have undergone less language contact than, for instance, English and Dutch, they still have a lot more grammatical genders. They still have that system in place. So that is an example of where you see that L2 learners, a high proportion of L2 learners, can lead to a loss of non-transparent features. There has been a lot of work on this topic, on this story, for instance, by Trudgill. In his 2011 book on social linguistic typology, he has shown that, or he has tried to link the process of simplification of languages to the types of communities that speak those languages. And he says, well, a language community that typically leads to a loss of opaque features, of non-transparent features. The typical language community that speaks a transparent language is a language community that is large, has loose social networks. So that means that people know some other people, but they don't know a few people really well. Sort of short explanation of that. There's a low amount of communally shared information, and there's a low stability. There are lots of changes in those social networks. So that is typically a community that loses opaque features and that speaks relatively transparent languages. And also there are circumstances that typically lead to a loss of opaque features. For instance, when there are relatively many L2 learners, as I said, for instance, because there's a lot of immigration into a language community, or when there are relatively few L1 learners, because, for instance, the language is endangered. And especially what in many cases has been demonstrated to lead to a loss of non-transparent features is what Trudgill calls short-term adult language contact. So contact between adults who have to acquire the other's language as an L2 within a short period of time. So there's no time to really acquire that L2, the language that the other one is speaking. But there's only little time and there's only short contact between L2 learners. In that case, you typically see a loss of opaque features. For instance, in the case of Creole emergence, you see this happening. And Trudgill is not the only one telling these stories. There are lots of other studies that support this idea, this relation between social historic circumstances and properties of the speaking community and a loss of opaque features and transparent languages. So in Custer's dissertation, he studies the complexity, so not the transparency, but the complexity of 4 typologically diverse languages. And he finds that complex phenomena are more prevalent in speech communities that have had a history of isolation. So an isolated community without much language contact retains complex phenomena. And then there are open communities with a history of much second language acquisition, and those typically have a more simple inflection in this case, in this study. Another study supporting this is by Lupien and Dill from 2010. They have done a statistical analysis of more than 2,000 languages in the World Atlas of Language Structures, the WALS. And they find various correlations between WALS features, so features of those languages, and the properties of the communities speaking those languages. And they find that languages spoken by large groups have simpler inflectional morphology and use more lexical rather than morphological means of expression, which is also thought to be simpler. So again, a relation between the speaker community and socio-historic circumstances and the features of the language. These last 2 studies were about complexity, but there is evidence that the same is true for transparency. There have been some studies on the relation between transparency and language contact. One by myself, in which I compared 4 Creole languages to their source languages, and I found indeed that the Creole languages had lost some opaque features with respect to those source languages. And also in 2018, Seguin performed a study on Haitian Creole, which shows fewer non-transparent features than its source languages. And Everett Kowalski found that modern Hebrew is more transparent than Old Hebrew, also, he thinks, due to language contact. So I think it's safe to say that degrees of transparency are, at least to some extent, the result of different socio-historical circumstances and social-linguistic properties of the speaker community. So that's one side of the coin. These social-linguistic factors explain how a language would lose non-transparent features and become more transparent. But of course, we have the other side of the coin as well. How does a language then develop non-transparency in the first place? Okay, we know now how a language loses non-transparent features, but how do you gain them? And again, the explanation is already there in historical linguistics. If we look at diachrony and the way that these non-transparent features come into existence. How does a language develop non-transparency? Well, if you look at a few non-transparent features, for instance, irregular stem formation, a case of fusion, is often the result of sound change. So for instance, there's a completely regular sound change that affects some verbs, but not all verbs. Then you might have irregular stem formation because some of the verbs are affected and others are not. So you get an irregularity there in the verb inflection, for example. Grammatical gender, a case of form-based form violation, is often a grammaticalized version of a classification system that used to have meaning. So it wasn't always a form-based form. It used to be a transparent classification system, but then over time through grammaticalization, it became a non-transparent feature. So in both cases, we see that a regular language change may lead a transparent feature to become non-transparent, a structure to become opaque. And this is what many of these non-transparent features are. There are historical remnants. They are, they used to be transparent, now they're non-transparent. And Roger Less has called this historical junk and also linguistic male nipples, because, well, those presumably also used to have a function, but now they don't anymore, but it's still there. Another term for that is vestigial organs. Wisdom teeth are another example of those. So those, as I said in the beginning, they used to have a function. They have over time lost that function, but they're still there. So many of these non-transparent features can be actually seen as these vestigial organs, as the sort of wisdom teeth of language. And of course, it takes time to develop these features. You cannot have this type of non-transparent features in a very young language. It takes time for these language changes to happen. And this is why, for instance, Stendhal calls these kind of phenomena maturation features. So they're really mature features of a language. They take time to develop. So combining these two sides of the coin, we can say that if we order languages from the transparent side to non-transparent side on a continuum, we can say that language contact and L2 acquisition, these typically drive languages to move to the left from non-transparent to transparent. At the same time, L1 acquisition, time, a language in isolation without much language contact drives a language to the right side, to the non-transparent side of this continuum. That's actually the idea if we combine the literature on the two processes. That is what happens and how we can explain the degrees of transparency of different languages. Okay, great story, you might think, but if we look at this ranking of languages again, there are some counterexamples. So for instance, Dutch has undergone quite some language contact, but is at the very non-transparent end of the continuum, while West Greenlandic, which is spoken in Greenland, so more isolated than Dutch, is somewhat lower on the ranking. At the same time, we have Haitian Creole, a Creole language. We would expect that on the very transparent side of the continuum, but it's somewhere in the middle. Mapudungun is not a Creole language, has almost no L2 speakers, so you would expect this higher up in the ranking. So language contact and this imperfect L2 acquisition story, clearly it doesn't explain the whole ranking. It cannot explain everything. So perhaps we have to look at other explanatory factors. Perhaps there are other factors playing a role here, perhaps language internally. I think we also need to take a closer look at the exact socio-historic circumstances. It could be the case that we simply haven't looked at those close enough, that we don't know about that enough. So that's something I would like to do in the future, to study the transparency of closely related language varieties that are structurally very similar, but socio-historically different. I think that would be a very interesting and useful next step to take in this respect. Yes, something else. We have discussed learnability, and I've said, well, we've now seen that languages differ in their degree of transparency. We've also seen that some types of non-transparency are difficult to learn for L2 learners and even for L1 learners. Combining these two findings implies that some languages must actually be harder to learn than others. And well, a while ago, like 50, 60 years ago, I think the assumption under linguists was that all languages were sort of equally difficult, equally learnable. So this goes right against that, right? Perhaps languages are not all equally learnable. Perhaps some are harder than others. Actually, in the area of L2 acquisition, this is not a very new thought, not a very new statement. There are more people who say that if you look at L2 acquisition, some languages might be harder to learn than others. For instance, John McWhorter is someone who believes that regardless of the differences between L1 and L2, of course, those matter as well, but if we abstract away from those, some languages may be harder to learn, especially languages with a lot of inflection. So for L2 acquisition, this is not a very new thing to say, or a very controversial thing to say. But for L1 acquisition, it is actually quite controversial to say that some languages are harder to learn than others. Because, of course, when we look at L1 learners, well, at least it appears to be the case that all L1 learners take the same amount of time to learn their mother language, right? It's not the case that we observe that German children acquire their first language earlier or quicker than, for instance, Brazilian children. And also there is empirical evidence from L1 acquisition that some features are harder than others. For instance, this grammatical gender is typically really difficult, but entire languages, there is no empirical evidence showing that some languages would be easier to acquire than others. And of course, the evidence is not there because it's really hard to study this or to falsify this idea, because yeah, how do you measure when a first language is acquired? And if you even could measure that, there are so many differences between the situations in which people learn their first languages that you don't really know whether it's really the learnability of the language or some other factor that causes those differences. So this is really impossible to know, probably. A final thing that I wanted to tell you about these topics, there's this really interesting paper by Elizabeth Riddle that I want to share with you because I found it very intriguing. She has also written about this question, like, can we say that some first languages, that some languages are easier to acquire even in first language acquisition? And she says, well, maybe we shouldn't look at the period, the time period in which a language is acquired. Maybe we should look at the process in which it is acquired. And she compares transparent languages to learning how to play the piano and non-transparent languages to learning how to play the violin. Probably, maybe if you have some experience with this, then you know that it is that if you start to learn to play the piano, you will quite soon be able to play a simple tune, right? While if you start to learn the violin, it will take you, well, maybe a year before you even get some nice tune out of it. So in that sense, it's easier to learn to play the piano than to learn the violin. But of course, if you want to be a solo piano professional player, that's equally difficult as becoming a solo violin performer. So she says it's not the whole time period that we should look at. We should look at the process, and they have a different flow in that process. So to quote her from this paper, although I doubt that anyone knowledgeable in music would claim that the task of a professional violin soloist is more difficult than that of a pianist, it is nonetheless true that for a beginner, it is easier to play a given note on the piano, where each note is associated with a separate key, than on the violin, where the strings form a continuum and the player must draw the line. This does not mean, however, that it is easier to become an Emmanuel X than a Yitzhak Perlman. I think that's a very nice way of looking at it. Okay, we have looked at the ranking of these features. Now let's continue by looking at the ranking of these. We have looked at the ranking of languages. Now we look at the ranking of the features. Because as you see, there's this ranking in features as well. They have a certain order as well. So this answers the second question. Is the presence of non-transparent features in languages random, or is there a pattern? Well, clearly there's a pattern. So this is called an implicational hierarchy. The presence of some of these non-transparent features implies the presence of others. If you see in a language, if you see that a language has, for instance, this feature, then according to the pattern, you know that it must have all these features below as well. That's the idea of this implicational hierarchy, which I have put on a slide here so that it's a bit easier to read. Now, if we look at this ordering, a few things are remarkable. So first of all, let's take a look at the top of the hierarchy. These are typically features that are these vestigial organs, like these features like grammatical gender that used to be transparent, but over time they've lost their function, they've lost their meaning, they've grammaticalized, and now they're just form-based forms. So we find a lot of those in this, at the upper part of the hierarchy, we find a lot of those kind of features. At the same time, if we look at the bottom of the hierarchy, we see a few redundancy features. These first three are all cases of redundancy. And then phonologically based alternations are, well, that's basically an FTG term for phonological assimilation. So where you have changes to phonemes, to the phonological shape of a word, because that makes the word easier to pronounce, for example. And what is striking about all these features at the bottom is that they have a clear communicative advantage. So redundancy is often said to be to have an advantage for communication because, well, if you say something twice, then you're more sure that your message comes across, right? I'll come back to that later, but it is often claimed that redundancy is actually a really handy thing to do in language. And then these phonological assimilations, of course, are also advantages because it will just be easier to pronounce. So these things at the bottom of the hierarchy, the non-transparent features that we see in all languages, they actually have clear communicative advantages. And then the fusion features are mostly found in the middle of the hierarchy. So summing up what I've just said about the ranking of the features, the presence of these vestigial organ features implies the presence of other non-transparent features. Only the most non-transparent languages have those kind of non-transparent features. But all languages exhibit redundancy features and phonological assimilation. So the features on the lower side of the hierarchy are typically features that are non-transparent, but still have some kind of communicative advantage, while the features on the upper side are typically, yeah, the vestigial organs and also the least learnable ones. So that is interesting, I think. Yes, we are right on schedule, and since I've again given you a lot of information, I suggest we take another short break. Again, I think some 3 or 4 minutes, just enough to for me to get a new drink and some water, and maybe for you as well. Okay, I see you in 3 minutes. Hello everyone, welcome back. I'd like to continue with part 3 of this talk, in which I will zoom in on redundancy. So as we've seen, redundancy is one category of violating transparency. And just to refresh our memories, redundancy involves cases where we have a one-to-many relation between meaning and form. So there's one meaning, for instance, a negation, that is expressed by multiple forms in a clause or phrase, as in the case of negative concord, for example. And this is, of course, inefficient or non-transparent. And I think redundancy is a very interesting category of non-transparent features for multiple reasons. First of all, because of this paradoxical effect on learnability. It's actually not so clear to me whether redundancy makes a language more learnable, easier to learn, or less learnable, harder to learn. You could say it makes languages harder to learn because, well, it's not transparent. So yeah, that seems not so ideal for a language learner. Also, you have more forms to learn. You have to acquire more forms. It's more complex, so you have more to do as a language learner. At the same time, it has also been argued, and it is, well, it could also be true that it makes languages easier because the repetition of an element facilitates transmission, but also if you hear something multiple times, it will be easier to remember it. I'll come back to this point later, but keep in mind that this is an interesting thing about redundancy. Also, redundancy is really common. We've just seen that all languages have redundancy in some form. Actually, if you start looking for it, you see that redundancy is really everywhere in language. At the same time, it hasn't been studied that much. Of course, for instance, agreement has been studied a lot, but never like for the reason of finding out why we would have this redundant marking. So these are reasons why I think redundancy is very interesting and why I wanted to take a closer look into this particular category of non-transparency. First, a bit more terminology. So we distinguish between different types of redundancy. I will be looking today at this first type, syntagmatic redundancy, where you have a single meaning that is expressed by multiple forms in one clause or phrase, like the negative concord example I showed you. So you have one meaning and you use it twice, basically. You express it twice, like the example with the cleaning lady and cleaning your house. You do the same thing twice. There's also a different type of redundancy, paradigmatic redundancy. And then applied to language, we are talking about the expression of a meaning that other languages do not express. So for instance, tense. In my first language, Dutch, I have to express tense on every verb that I use. There are, of course, many languages in which that's not obligatory. So for instance, Mandarin Chinese, you don't have to express tense. So you could say, well, the expression of tense is redundant. You don't need to do that. A language can function perfectly well without tense. So that's also a type of redundancy, and that's called paradigmatic redundancy. And even though it's a very interesting thing to study, that will not be the topic today. I have studied this kind of redundancy where you have one meaning expressed multiple times in the same clause or phrase. And syntagmatic redundancy, you find it a lot in language. And I'm looking at the system level only. I mean, if you also look at what speakers do, they repeat themselves within a sentence continuously. But just looking at the language system, so at the grammar forcing you to be redundant, this happens a lot in languages. So for instance, verb argument agreement, properties of the argument are also expressed, for instance, by affixes on a verb. Phrasal agreement, for instance, gender agreement, number agreement, case agreement, determiner agreement, where you say this, the book, for instance, also type of redundancy. Comparative or superlative doubling, like most, bestest. Negative concord, already mentioned, subject pronoun doubling, complementizer doubling. Well, there are lots and lots and lots of cases of syntagmatic redundancy in languages. And in some cases, redundant marking may have some kind of pragmatic or semantic effect. For instance, an emphatic effect. Of course, when you repeat something, you sort of stress it at the same time. In many cases, it has this emphatic effect, or in some cases, people are redundant, or you have to use syntagmatic redundancy to disambiguate between arguments, for example, or because of information structure, you can mark something as a focus constituent by means of redundant marking. So there are, again, all kinds of effects that all these phenomena may have. So maybe good to say this about the term redundancy. Of course, redundancy implies that you can do away with it, that it's not necessary. But in a lot of these cases, there is actually an effect that it has. So it does do something. It's not literally redundant in that you can just as well leave it out. The grammar also requires you to be redundant. So why I use this term redundancy is because there is a meaning that is expressed multiple times. So theoretically, that is redundancy. In the literature on redundancy, on syntagmatic redundancy, it is often claimed that all languages have this. So, for instance, Sadok says redundancy is in fact a fundamental feature of the design of language. So it is really one of the core features. Some other statements about this: all languages include redundancy and excess of means relative to the information actually transmitted. All languages contain redundancy, but it is possible that some languages have more redundancy than others. Aha, we'll see about that in a minute. Of course, no language lacks redundancy. So all these linguists seem to be convinced that all languages indeed have some kind of syntagmatic redundancy. That's the first thing that claims are often made about that all languages have it. Another thing is that redundancy is very often claimed to have communicative advantages. Well, I just claimed that as well, right? For instance, Ostendal says by increasing redundancy, the sender can reduce the risk of faulty delivery. If you repeat something, then you're more sure that it comes across. All languages contain redundancy, which seems to be necessary for successful communication, especially in less than perfect circumstances. Redundancy enhances the saliency of an utterance. Redundancy can be beneficial because it can increase distinctiveness. So all kinds of advantages that redundancy is claimed to have. And these are all advantages for a speaker who wants to be clear. But redundancy is also claimed to have advantages for the receiving end of the story. For instance, Coles-White says redundant information is easier to process. Syntagmatic dependencies complicate learning but add redundancy, and so facilitate processing by the fluent speaker. Redundancy facilitates interpretation of a novel construction. Rather than making a language harder to process and learn, redundant marking of gender, in this case, actually facilitates the acquisition of gender. There's a statement we've seen before, right? So these are all statements that actually say, well, redundancy makes languages easier. Easier to process, easier to learn even. Actually, there are a lot of these statements, as I said, and well, they're intuitively correct, I would say, but actually there's very little empirical evidence for this. So there's little typological evidence for the claim that it is universal. Of course, in my PhD dissertation that I just described, I found that all the languages in the sample had some form of redundancy, but those were only 22 languages, which is not enough to claim that something is universal. And also there's little psycholinguistic evidence supporting these cognitive advantages. So the facilitation of processing and learning, there's no clear evidence that that is actually the case. And it's also really hard to study this, to find this evidence, for multiple reasons. First of all, the definition of redundancy is often very broad. People usually define it as, well, cases of repetition or something. And then that definition is, of course, so broad that you have to take into account so many things. And yeah, of course, then it's universal. If it applies to everything, then yeah, of course, all languages have it. And also the definition of redundancy is often very theory dependent. For instance, in generative grammar, linguists often speak of covert redundancy, where you have an overlap in meaning between an overt element and a covert element. For instance, there's an invisible phonologically null operator for negation, for instance, that is in agreement with an overt negator. In that case, you have redundancy, but in other frameworks, such a thing would not be possible. So it's very difficult to come to a definition of redundancy that that allows us to study these degrees of redundancy and to see if it's really the case that all languages have this, and then possibly whether there are these cognitive advantages to it. So that's difficult, but of course that makes it worth doing. So let me tell you about a preliminary study that I did, or an explorative study that I did into the typology of redundancy. Again, asking actually the same questions about transparency earlier. Do all languages exhibit an equal amount of redundancy? And is the presence of redundancy features in languages random, or can we see a pattern? Like with the implicational hierarchy of non-transparent features, can we find a similar pattern in this domain? And to test this, to find the first answer to these questions, I've looked at what I've called concord, or a meaning overlap between lexical and grammatical elements. I've looked at 4 types. There are way more. I've just, you gotta start somewhere, so that's what I did. First of all, I've looked at what I call here argument concord. For instance, in a sentence like she speaks, we see that the third person singular meanings are expressed both by the pronoun and by the verbal inflection. So there's meaning overlap here between these two, between the lexical and the grammatical element. That's what I've called argument concord. I mean, usually you would call this subject-verb agreement, but I wanted to stay as theory neutral as possible, and agreement has all these connotations. Then temporal concord, that is when a temporal adverb, like yesterday, and a tense marker overlap in meaning. So both yesterday and the verbal inflection here indicate past, indicates that it happened in the past. So here too we have redundancy. We have one meaning, past, expressed in different places in the same sentence. Then negative concord, I've shown you other examples of it, but here is again a negator, a grammatical negator, and a lexical negator that together express one semantic negation. And then finally we have plural concord, where there is a +1 numeral, so 5 in this case, that expresses that it's more than 1. And then the plural marker does the same. It says, well, this is more than 1. So we have the same meaning expressed by a lexical and a grammatical element. 4 cases of concord, 4 cases of redundancy. What I've done is, again, I've scored 50 languages for their concord. So I've checked these 4 types in 50 languages, which of these 4 types of concord they have. And I use the same sample as Rijkhoff 2002. That's a study of the noun phrase, and he also studied this plural concord in his study. So that's why I simply used his sample. I already had collected he collected the plural concord data, and I only had to add the data on the other 3 types. And I did so again by grammar mining. So I've looked in reference grammars whether these types of concord were possible in these languages. I couldn't find all the data that I needed. I couldn't always get a hold of the good descriptions. So in some cases, again, I've consulted authors and experts for additional information, but sometimes it was still not possible to find all the relevant data. And I counted something as syntagmatic redundancy as a case of concord redundancy when the lexical and the grammatical element could occur in the same clause or phrase overtly, regardless of the effect that it had. So whether there was a semantic or pragmatic effect or not, I've left that out of the picture. And regardless of any syntactic restrictions, sometimes there is negative concord if the negator is post-verbal or the other way around, but not in all cases. I have not looked at those kind of restrictions. So just if it's possible in one configuration, then I count it as a yes, it's possible in this language to have concord in this case. And I'll show you what that looked like. So argument concord, for instance, in Abras, that is possible. So you can express a pronoun, an argument by means of a pronoun, and then you, at the same time, you express the same information on the verb. So Abras has argument concord. There were also languages where this concord feature didn't apply because, for instance, in this language, in Berbice Dutch Creole, there is no verb marking of arguments. There is no way to mark pronominal information about the argument on the verb. So it would simply not be possible to have concord here, to have an overlap in meaning between the pronoun and verbal marking, because there is no verbal marking. So in these cases, I've marked these languages as not applicable. And there were actually no languages in the sample that didn't allow for this kind of concord. So that's why I couldn't give you an example of that. Temporal concord is present, for instance, in Korean. We see that it is allowed to have a temporal adverb expressing pastness and a tense marker expressing pastness at the same time. There were also languages where this feature didn't apply, for instance, Mandarin Chinese, where tense is not expressed. Of course, if you don't express tense, you cannot have an overlap in meaning between tense and a temporal adverb. So again, this doesn't apply here. Negative concord, there are languages with negative concord in the sample. So Hungarian, for instance, you have nobody and not together expressing one semantic negation. And there are also languages without negative concord. Dutch is an example where every negating word, lexical element, or grammatical element actually triggers a semantic negation of their own. So there's no redundancy here. There's no meaning that is expressed by multiple forms. There is one negator here expressed by this form, and there's another negator that is expressed by this form. So no case of redundancy, no concord. And then there were languages where this didn't apply because there is no lexical element expressing negation. And as an example, I give Ngalakan here. You see that Ngalakan has a grammatical negation marker. So there's a negation here, not give, is what this says basically. And then there's a word that is translated as nobody. So you could say, oh, this is negative concord because we have nobody and we have not, combining into nobody will give poor me my fish. But actually, if you look at this word, at the nobody part, you see that it actually doesn't express a negation. If you use it without the not part, it has a positive meaning. So that's why I didn't count this as a negative element that is able to have negation semantics by itself. And this therefore is not a case of negative concord. It just doesn't apply. There cannot be concord because there is no lexical element that can overlap with the grammatical element. Right, final case of concord is plural concord, where you have the +1 numeral and the plural marking, like here in Pipil, which has plural concord. There are also languages like Turkish which don't allow for plural concord. So in Turkish, there is a plural marker to indicate that there is more than one of the noun. But if you use the +1 numeral, then you don't use that plural marker. It's one or the other, but not both, no concord. And again, then there are languages where this doesn't apply, for instance, because there is no plural marker, like in nung. Right, on to the results. Here you see the table with a plus if some type of concord is present in the languages. Here you see the languages, and the list continues here. Again, this is a lot of information to process at once. It's too much on one slide. The only thing really that you need to get from this table is that there is no pattern. As you see, it's rather chaotic. In some cases, there are many pluses. In other cases, here we have a lot of minuses. There's really not a clean pattern like with the non-transparent features where you have this hierarchy. That's not there for redundancy. What you can get from these results is that the different types of concord are, well, some are more frequent than others. So argument concord and temporal concord in languages where concord is possible, so where the feature was applicable, 100% of the languages allowed for it. So if you can express it twice, you may do so. Negative concord in 7 of the 8 cases, 7 of 8 languages where there was both a lexical negative element and a grammatical negative element, they could be combined. So also pretty frequent, but plural concord was less common. So there are many languages that have +1 numerals as well as plural marking, but in more than half of those languages, they weren't allowed to be combined. So that's interesting, these different frequencies, I think. Some intermediate conclusions here. Languages differ in the number of concord features they have. So some languages exhibit more redundancy than others. While at the same time, some types of concord do seem to be universal, or of course, 50 language sample is not enough to claim universality, but at least they seem to be very, very common. Another conclusion here is that there's no implicational hierarchy of concord. Then one question remains, or well, actually many questions, but one follow-up question that I had looking at these data is, why are some types of concord more restricted than others? Why is argument concord allowed in all these languages, while plural concord is often not allowed? And I really don't know yet. I'm thinking about this, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. One thing I'm thinking is that perhaps we should look at diachrony here, so about how these redundant features, how these different types of concord originate. Of course, with negation, we have Jesperson's cycle. So this cycle where languages have a negative marker, a grammatical marker of negation. This, over time, it weakens, and optionally, if people want to emphasize the negation, they add a negative adverb or noun of some sort. At some point, that optional lexical element becomes obligatory as well, and we have 2 negators in the same class, so we have negative concord. Then at some point, you see that the negative adverb becomes obligatory while the verbal marker becomes optional. And in the end, there's further grammaticalization. The verbal marker is lost while the negative adverb remains and itself grammaticalizes into a grammatical marker. So that is basically Jesperson's cycle, right? We have this cycle driven by the need to emphasize on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have grammaticalization that causes elements to be lost. As for instance, happened in Dutch. And I have, in some of the stages in this cycle, carry redundancy. So the ones printed bold here, 2, 3, and 4, all these cases involve redundancy. And a similar cycle exists for argument concord. At least some would say that there is an, I hear that there's a message. Okay, I'm just going to continue the story unless I am warned. So there's a similar cycle for argument concord, where subject, obligatory subject pronouns are introduced, subject clitics are weakened, and then new stressed pronouns are added. Both clitics and the new pronouns become obligatory. Then at some point the clitics become optional and are in the end lost. So there's a similar cycle here, but then with argument concord. And this is, for instance, what is argued to be happening in contemporary French. Perhaps this is something we should consider when we look at redundancy. Perhaps there's a similar cycle for temporal concord or for plural concord, or maybe that's not the case, and there is a similar cycle for temporal concord, but not for plural concord, and that is why plural concord is much more restricted in the languages of the world. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to continue and not dwell on this any longer. Final thing to say here is that perhaps the diachronic behavior of the different types of redundancy can help us understand why some types are common while others are restricted. Right, I've already been talking for a long time, so let me come to my final conclusions. I have shown you today that violations of transparency exist in at least 3 types. So we've looked at form-based form features, fusion, and redundancy features. The typological study of these features has shown us that no language is 100% transparent, but some languages violate transparency more than others. Non-transparent features found in all languages are all features that have some communicative advantage, like redundancy or phonological assimilations. There are also non-transparent features that are much more rare, that are only found in the least transparent languages. These are also the least learnable features, the vestigial organs of language. We've also seen that a language's degree of transparency can at least partly be understood from social linguistic factors, because a language with a high proportion of L2 speakers undergoing short-term adult language contact becomes more transparent, and languages in isolation become less transparent over time. So that explains the ranking of languages. Then about redundancy, there seems to be consensus or a lot of evidence that form-based form and fusion are difficult features, are difficult to learn, but it is quite unclear how redundancy contributes to learnability. We've seen that all languages allow for redundancy, but they differ in the amount of redundancy they exhibit and in the types of redundancy that they allow. There's no evidence for a hierarchy of redundancy. And some types of concord or redundancy might be stages in a continuous cycle driven by emphasis and grammaticalization, but not all types. Right, that is my story for today. Thank you very much for listening. And yeah, I see that Gisela is here, who probably is going to ask me some questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Sterre. We appreciated a lot your presentation. They were very interesting. And I have 3 questions for you, okay? In our chat. And the number 1 is, why are 2 futures morphophonologic conditioned alternations, and cross-reference not applicable to some languages?
Let me go to the slide. I stop sharing for a moment so that I can scroll to the relevant slide. So morphologically conditioned stem alternation and cross-reference.
Yes.
I think I see what the question is about. I will share my screen again.
Okay.
I think the person asking these questions is referring to this part of the table where we see that for Fangbe and Haitian Creole, there's not applicable in this table for these specific features. I would have to check this because it's a few years ago and I don't remember every data point in this table, but I think what it means is simply that we have not been able to find this information. In the case of cross-reference, I think it's the case that in Fangbe and Haitian Creole, I'm guessing here that there's no verbal marking of arguments. This cross-reference is the FDG term for argument concord, basically. So apparently Fangbe and Haitian Creole do not have this verbal marking of arguments, so there cannot be cross-reference or agreement or concord between a lexical item and the grammatical item. The grammatical item is not there, so there cannot be concord here. I think that's why there's not applicable here. Okay. But I would have to go back to the data and check that. So if the person wants to know more, please let me know, and then we can email about that.
Okay. The number 2 is there any evidence that a similar degree of transparency between L1 and L2 is advantageous for learnings of L2?
A similar degree between the L1 and the L2. I don't know, but I do know that this is being studied at the moment by Lissant Taal, a PhD at the University of Amsterdam. She is studying the acquisition of second language acquisition, and she's comparing people with a very transparent first language learning a very non-transparent second language to people with a very non-transparent first language and a very transparent second language. So she is looking at these degrees of transparency in relation to second language learning. So if you're learning, if you're going from knowing a transparent language to learning a non-transparent language, is that harder than the other way around? And also if you already, and she's also comparing, if I'm right, people with a non-transparent first language, when they learn a non-transparent second language, is that an advantage? Does it help if you already know a non-transparent language? Does it help you in acquiring another one? That is, of course, a very interesting question. And I really don't know the answer yet, but as I said, I know it is being studied, so hopefully we get the answer soon. Yeah, I'm sorry I can't give you a more satisfying answer, but work in progress.
Okay, thank you. And the last, we have Kitemu being an agglutinative language, complex and transparent, is being ranked in the middle among other languages owing to a number of grammatical features. So can you comment on its learnability?
So can you repeat that first bit? So a complex language, agglutinative language that is very transparent. Is that the question?
Yes. The question is, we have a statement, Kitemu being an agglutinative language, complex and transparent, as being ranked in the middle among other languages, owing to a number of grammatical features. It's a statement. The question is, so can you comment on its learnability?
I think, yeah, that's a very interesting question, because actually what the question is about is, or what we would need to know is the relation between complexity, so the amount of form, and transparency. Which one contributes more to the learnability of a language? So I would say that a language that's, so the transparency of a language, Tamil in this case, makes it more learnable generally, while the complexity makes it harder to learn. So yeah, that would mean that it is somewhere in the middle in learnability, but of course it's hard to quantify that, to say, oh, this is medium learnable or something. But that would be my prediction, that Tamil would not be the hardest language to learn ever, but also definitely not the simplest, because of the complexity, because of the amount of form that needs to be acquired. I hope this answers the question.
Okay, so these are all the questions in the chat. So I have my one question.
Yeah.
I am studying, I wrote it by email, and Portuguese and German language. And I'd like to know about the verb system. Can I classify, I am studying imperative forms in the both language. And I would like to know if this an evidence about it, no transparent procedure or a transparent procedure, because we have in Portuguese a lot of varied form to express the imperative way, the imperative. And I'm looking for this in Germany too. And I'm thinking, oh, it's a transparent way or not transparent way. So, what do you think about this?
I would say it depends on whether the different imperatives really have a different meaning, or
Yes.
meaning is not the right word here, but a different pragmatic.
Yes, I'm looking for the pragmatic statement. Yes.
Yeah. So I think, if I'm right in Portuguese, there are all these different imperatives with clearly different, which you would not be able to confuse, right? They would really have their own uses.
Okay.
So that would be a case of complexity, I'd say. You have more, but that's trans each meaning for each different. Screen froze. Can you still hear me, Gisela? Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Now yes.
Yeah.
I'm
so
hearing.
In German. Okay, good. Yeah, in German, I think there are. I'm not sure. I'm not very familiar with the German imperatives. Are much like Dutch imperatives, and there are not so many forms. So you could say that the system of imperatives in German is probably, I expect, simpler. There are fewer forms, fewer distinct types. At the same time, all these meanings that the Brazilian imperatives are able to express, you can express them in German as well. But you have fewer forms to do so. So my expectation would be that the German imperative system is simpler but less transparent.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much, Professor Sterre. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon.
Thank you.
I wanted to remind for everybody the importance of joining Abralin to strengthen the area and engage the community in this project, inviting everyone to continue watching and sharing the conferences with your colleagues and friends. And you can also collaborate with many projects too. You can check our schedule of the events Abralin website and in the media socials. And Professor Sterre, if you want to say finally words, you can.
Well, thank you very much for the organization, for inviting me today, but also for the organization of the other lectures. I think it's a real, it's a great thing that all of a sudden, every day there are lectures on all kinds of linguistic topics by really great scholars. So thank you very much for that.
Okay. Thank you so much again. It's a pleasure. I wish you a nice evening for you. For us here in Brazil, it's afternoon. It's 2 afternoon. It's a pleasure to listening you today. Thank you so much to collaborate with the project, with